In the locked vault of a Boston medical archive behind 3 layers of security clearance sits a photograph that researchers are forbidden to study for more than 20 minutes at a time. The image shows a young boy, eyes closed, hands folded, sitting peacefully in an ornate Victorian chair. But this is not a sleeping child. This is James Morrison, dead for 3 days when this photograph was taken in January 1888. What his mother did to preserve him, the experiments she conducted on his body, and the genetic curse that ran through his bloodline would create one of the most disturbing artifacts in American medical history. A photograph that scientists claim can alter your brain activity just by looking at it. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Morrison family's curse began long before James was born, buried in genealogical records that tell a story no one wanted to acknowledge. When Helena Ashworth married Thomas Morrison in 1876, Boston's elite society whispered about the union behind gloved hands and closed parlor doors. Not because of scandal or impropriety, but because everyone who mattered knew the truth about the Morrison bloodline. The Morrisons had arrived in Massachusetts in 1642, part of the Puritan migration, and for 2 centuries they had done something that was common among isolated colonial families, but rarely spoken of openly. They had married within their own family circle with such frequency that their family tree had ceased to branch outward and instead twisted back upon itself like a serpent consuming its own tail. Church records from Salem County reveal a pattern that would horrify modern geneticists: 14 documented marriages between first cousins, 7 unions between uncles and nieces, and at least 3 cases where the exact relationship between bride and groom was so tangled that parish priests struggled to calculate the degrees of consanguinity. By the time Thomas Morrison was born in 1848, the genetic damage was undeniable. He stood barely 5 feet tall, walked with a pronounced limp, and suffered from what family doctors euphemistically called nervous disorders. His younger sister had been born with a cleft palate so severe she could barely speak. 2 brothers died in infancy from what modern medicine would recognize as genetic abnormalities incompatible with life. A cousin spent her entire existence in a locked room on the 3rd floor of the family estate, her mind never developing beyond that of a young child. Thomas himself was the product of a marriage between second cousins whose own parents had been first cousins. The genetic pool from which he emerged was so shallow, so depleted of diversity, that every child born into the Morrison line carried the accumulated burden of generations of inbreeding. When he married Helena Ashworth, there was hope that fresh blood might dilute the curse. Helena came from a respectable family with no Morrison connections, a woman of unusual education who had studied medicine in Paris at a time when such pursuits were considered scandalous for a woman. But hope proved insufficient against the weight of corrupted genetics. When James was born in 1879, the delivery was difficult and prolonged. The child emerged smaller than normal, with skin so pale it seemed translucent under lamplight. More concerning were the subtle abnormalities that became apparent in his first months of life. His skull was slightly misshapen, his eyes set too far apart, and his fingers showed a webbing between the digits that required minor surgical correction. The family physician, Dr. Edmund Cartwright, documented in his private journals what he observed in young James, the unmistakable signs of genetic damage that marked every Morrison child born in the last 3 generations. As James grew, other manifestations of his corrupted inheritance became apparent. He suffered seizures that would leave him rigid and unresponsive for hours. His growth was stunted, and by age 8 he stood no taller than a 6-year-old. But perhaps most disturbing was his condition that the family called the sleeping sickness, episodes where James would fall into states so deep that no stimulus could wake him, his breathing barely perceptible, his heartbeat so faint it could scarcely be detected. These episodes, which modern medicine would recognize as a form of catalepsy caused by neurological damage from inbreeding, would last anywhere from hours to days. Each time the family would gather around his bed, uncertain whether James would ever wake again. Helena Morrison was not a typical Victorian mother, and her response to her son's condition was anything but conventional. While other wealthy Boston families might have hidden their defective children in distant institutions or kept them sequestered in upper-floor rooms, Helena chose a different path. She would use every resource at her disposal, every fragment of medical knowledge she had acquired in Paris, to keep James alive. What she couldn't have predicted was how her obsession would transform from saving her son's life to something far more disturbing. Helena's education in Paris had exposed her to medical theories and practices that existed in the shadows of legitimate science. During her studies at the Sorbonne in the early 1870s, she had attended lectures by doctors who experimented with preservation techniques that went far beyond conventional embalming. These men spoke of maintaining tissue elasticity for months after death, of chemical compounds that could arrest decay almost indefinitely, and, most controversially, of methods that might preserve some spark of consciousness even after the heart had stopped beating. These ideas were considered dangerous by the medical establishment, but Helena had absorbed them with the intensity of someone who sensed they might one day prove necessary. When diphtheria swept through Boston in the winter of 1887, claiming dozens of children each week, Helena knew immediately that James would not survive an infection. His weakened constitution, the result of generations of genetic degradation, left him vulnerable to diseases that other children might overcome. She had watched him through 8 years of increasingly severe episodes of the sleeping sickness, each one lasting longer than the last, each one leaving him weaker when he finally woke. She had documented every symptom in detailed medical journals, tracking the progress of his condition with scientific precision that bordered on obsession. On December 23, 1887, James complained of a sore throat. By evening, the characteristic membrane of diphtheria had formed across his airway. Helena immediately isolated him in his room and began treatments that Dr. Cartwright would later describe as aggressive to the point of recklessness. She administered experimental medications she had imported from Europe, compounds whose chemical composition remained unknown to American physicians. She performed therapeutic procedures that had no basis in conventional medicine, but despite everything, James's condition deteriorated rapidly. By January 2, 1888, James had entered what appeared to be his final episode of the sleeping sickness. But this time, Helena noticed something different. His breathing had slowed to an almost imperceptible rate. His heartbeat had become so faint that even she, with her medical training, could barely detect it. His skin had taken on a waxy quality that suggested the early stages of death, yet there was something about his condition that didn't align with true mortality. His body temperature remained slightly above what would be expected in a corpse, and there was a subtle color in his cheeks that suggested blood still circulated, however slowly, through his vessels. For 3 days, Helena kept vigil beside James's bed, while Dr. Cartwright examined him repeatedly and finally, reluctantly, pronounced him dead on January the 5th at 9:15 in the morning. But Helena knew something the doctor didn't. She had been conducting her own experiments on James throughout his illness, administering compounds that were designed not to cure the diphtheria, but to preserve his body in a state that might allow some continuation of existence beyond conventional death. The medical journals she kept during this period, discovered decades later, revealed the depth of her obsession and the shocking nature of her experiments. She had been preparing for James's death long before it occurred, and she had plans for what would come after. What Helena Morrison did in the 48 hours following Dr. Cartwright's declaration of death has never been fully documented, but fragments of evidence pieced together from multiple sources paint a disturbing picture. She dismissed all servants from the house, locked herself in James's room, and began a process that combined legitimate medical preservation techniques with procedures that crossed into territory no ethical physician would ever enter. Helena had spent months acquiring specialized equipment and chemical compounds through discrete channels that connected her to experimental medical researchers in France and Germany. Among the items discovered later in her laboratory were glass vessels containing solutions whose exact composition was never determined, syringes of unusual design capable of precise injection into specific tissues, and journals filled with anatomical diagrams annotated in a mixture of English, French, and Latin medical terminology. Most disturbing were the detailed procedural notes describing techniques for maintaining tissue perfusion after cardiac arrest and methods for preserving neurological tissue in states that might retain some form of function. The preservation process Helena performed on James went far beyond conventional embalming. Rather than simply replacing blood with preservative fluids through the major vessels, she appears to have conducted a complex series of injections targeting specific organs and tissue types. Her notes reference maintaining cellular integrity, preserving membrane potential, and sustaining what she called residual consciousness, a term that had no meaning in legitimate medical science, but which appeared repeatedly throughout her journals. By the time she emerged from James's room 36 hours after beginning her work, she had transformed her son's body into something that defied easy categorization. James appeared not dead, but suspended in a state between life and death that was unprecedented in medical literature. His skin retained an unusual suppleness and color. His tissues showed none of the typical rigor mortis or early decomposition that would be expected. Most unnervingly, there was a quality to his appearance that suggested not the peace of death, but something closer to deep sleep, as though he might open his eyes at any moment. When Helena finally allowed Dr. Cartwright to examine James again, the physician was deeply unsettled by what he observed. In his private correspondence with colleagues, he described the preservation as technically masterful, but fundamentally wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. The body showed signs of death: no heartbeat, no respiration, no response to stimuli. Yet it also retained characteristics of life that should have been impossible. Cartwright noted that James's eyes, though closed, showed subtle movements beneath the lids, as though experiencing dreams. The muscle tone was not the flaccidity of death, but something that suggested maintained neurological input. Helena's explanation to Dr. Cartwright was deliberately vague. She claimed to have used advanced European preservation techniques learned during her studies in Paris, methods that allowed for more natural appearance in post-mortem subjects. She assured him that everything she had done was legal and medically sound, though she declined to provide specific details about the compounds and procedures she had employed. Cartwright, uncomfortable with the situation, but lacking evidence of any specific violation, agreed not to pursue the matter further. He would regret that decision for the rest of his life. What Helena had actually achieved was something that would not be understood for decades. She had used the unique neurological condition caused by James's inbred genetics, his tendency toward deep cataleptic states, and combined it with experimental preservation techniques to create a condition where some aspects of consciousness might persist even after clinical death. Whether this was intentional or an unexpected result of her procedures remains unclear, but the evidence suggests Helena understood far more about what she was doing than she ever admitted. Augustus Pemberton had photographed the dead for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything death could present. He had positioned hundreds of corpses, painted life onto countless pallid faces, and created illusions of peace for grieving families across New England. But when Helena Morrison contacted him on January 7, 1888, offering a sum that equaled 6 months of his usual income for a single photographic session, he should have recognized that something was fundamentally different about this commission. Pemberton arrived at the Morrison mansion expecting a standard post-mortem sitting, albeit one for a wealthy client willing to pay premium rates. What he found instead was a scene that would haunt him for the remaining 31 years of his life. Helena had transformed the parlor into something between a photographic studio and a medical theater. James was positioned in an ornate mahogany chair, dressed in a black velvet suit that had been tailored specifically for this purpose, his hands arranged on the chair arms in a pose that suggested dignity rather than death. The first thing Pemberton noticed was the quality of the preservation. In 15 years of post-mortem photography, he had never seen a body maintain such a lifelike appearance 3 days after death. James's skin retained natural color and elasticity. There was no sign of the bloating or discoloration that typically began within hours of death. Most unnervingly, when Pemberton adjusted the boy's position slightly to improve the composition, the body responded with a suppleness that should have been impossible. The muscles moved naturally, the joints flexed without the resistance of rigor mortis, and there was a warmth to the skin that defied explanation. Helena supervised every aspect of the session with an intensity that went beyond normal maternal grief. She had calculated precise lighting, angles, specified exact camera positions, and insisted on particular exposure durations that seemed arbitrary to Pemberton, but which she insisted were critical to capturing what she called the essential presence of her son. She made detailed notes throughout the session, recording not just photographic data, but observations about James's appearance, the room's temperature and humidity, and measurements whose purpose Pemberton could not determine. During the lengthy exposure required for the main portrait, a full 4 minutes during which both photographer and subject had to remain perfectly still, Pemberton experienced something that shook his professional composure. As he stood behind the camera watching James through the ground glass focusing screen, he could have sworn he detected movement. Not the gross shifting of a body settling, but subtle changes in facial expression, the slightest tension around the closed eyes, and a barely perceptible alteration in the position of the hands. He convinced himself it was an optical illusion created by staring too long at a static image, but the sensation of having witnessed something impossible remained. When Pemberton finally developed the glass plate negatives in his studio 2 days later, what he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. The images were technically perfect, demonstrating all his considerable skill as a photographer. But there was something in them that transcended technical excellence. James Morrison's portrait did not look like a photograph of a dead child arranged to appear peaceful. It looked like a photograph of a child in profound sleep, captured at the exact moment before waking. The closed eyes seemed to contain awareness. The relaxed posture suggested not death's rigidity, but rest's tranquility. Most disturbing of all, there were aspects of the image that Pemberton could not remember seeing during the actual session, subtle details in lighting and shadow that created the impression of breathing, of life suspended rather than ended. Pemberton made multiple prints of the main portrait for Helena Morrison, but he kept one for himself, not as a proud example of his work, but as evidence of something he couldn't explain and wasn't certain anyone would believe. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? James Morrison was buried on January 10, 1888, in the family plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery. The funeral was small, attended only by a handful of Morrison relatives who maintained enough contact with the family to observe social obligations. Helena stood at the graveside in black mourning dress, dry-eyed and composed in a way that disturbed those present. She showed no tears, no visible grief, only an intense focus as the ornate casket was lowered into the frozen ground. Several attendees later reported that Helena seemed to be listening for something, her head tilted slightly as if trying to hear sounds from beneath the earth. What none of the mourners knew was that Helena had made special arrangements for James's burial. The casket had been custom-built to her specifications, with an interior lined with materials designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions. She had insisted on a burial depth of only 4 feet rather than the standard 6, claiming concerns about groundwater seepage. Most significantly, she had arranged for a discreet ventilation system to be installed, a narrow copper tube that extended from the casket to just below ground surface, ostensibly to prevent gas buildup, but serving a purpose that only Helena understood. In the weeks following the burial, Helena visited the grave daily. Cemetery workers reported seeing her there at unusual hours, sometimes before dawn, often remaining until after dark. She would sit beside the grave for hours, sometimes appearing to speak quietly as though conducting a one-sided conversation. On several occasions, groundskeepers reported seeing her place her hand flat against the earth above James's casket, remaining motionless in that position for extended periods as though feeling for something beneath the soil. Dr. Cartwright, increasingly concerned about Helena's mental state, visited her at the mansion in late January. What he discovered alarmed him profoundly. Helena had converted James's bedroom into what could only be described as a monitoring station. She had installed equipment whose purpose Cartwright could not immediately identify: sensitive thermometers, barometric instruments, and devices that appeared designed to detect vibrations or movements at a distance. Most disturbing was a journal in which Helena recorded daily observations using terminology that combined medical notation with references that bordered on the mystical. When Cartwright confronted Helena about the purpose of this equipment, her response was both matter-of-fact and deeply unsettling. She explained that the preservation techniques she had used on James were experimental and required ongoing monitoring to assess their long-term effectiveness. She claimed that the chemical compounds she had introduced into his tissues might maintain certain cellular functions for weeks or even months after clinical death, and that she was conducting a legitimate scientific investigation into post-mortem tissue preservation. But her eyes, as she spoke, held an intensity that suggested she believed something more, that some essential aspect of James might persist in the preserved body, that consciousness itself might continue in some form, even in the grave. Cartwright attempted to convince Helena to seek treatment for what he considered clear signs of pathological grief complicated by her medical background. But Helena dismissed his concerns with cold rationality. She pointed out that her observations were scientifically rigorous, her equipment properly calibrated, her methods documented according to proper experimental protocols. She was not mad, she insisted. She was conducting research that would advance medical understanding of the boundaries between life and death. The fact that the subject of this research was her own dead son was regrettable, but did not invalidate the scientific value of her work. By early February, Helena's behavior had become erratic enough that relatives began discussing the possibility of having her committed. But before any action could be taken, something happened that would transform the case from a tragedy of maternal grief into something far stranger and more disturbing. On February the 15th, 1888, an anonymous letter arrived at the office of the Massachusetts State Medical Board. The letter, written in precise handwriting that suggested medical training, alleged that Helena Morrison had conducted illegal medical experiments on her son both before and after his death. It provided specific details about equipment observed in the Morrison household, chemical compounds that had been imported through irregular channels, and procedures that violated both medical ethics and state law regarding the treatment of human remains. The letter demanded immediate investigation and, if evidence warranted, exhumation of James Morrison's body. The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed, driven by the detailed nature of the allegations and growing concerns among Boston's medical community about experimental practices occurring outside legitimate oversight. Within a week, authorities had obtained a court order for exhumation. Helena Morrison, when informed of the order, showed no surprise and made no attempt to contest it. Instead, she made one simple request, that she be allowed to be present when the casket was opened. The request was denied. The exhumation took place on February the 23rd, just 6 weeks after James's burial. A team consisting of the county coroner, 2 physicians from Massachusetts General Hospital, and several legal observers gathered at Mount Auburn Cemetery as workers began removing earth from above the Morrison plot. What they discovered as the casket emerged challenged every assumption they had made about what they would find. The custom casket, when finally raised from its shallow grave, appeared to be in perfect condition despite the winter moisture. More unnervingly, when workers lifted it, they reported that it seemed warmer than the surrounding earth, as though heat was being generated from within. The ventilation tube, B, Helena had insisted upon was still in place, its opening carefully disguised among the grave markers. When the coroner examined this tube closely, he detected what he later described as subtle air movement, as though something in the sealed casket was still consuming or producing gases. The moment the casket was opened would be seared into the memory of every witness present. After 6 weeks in the ground, James Morrison's body showed almost no signs of decomposition. The preservation was so complete that several observers initially believed the body had been replaced with a wax effigy, but closer examination confirmed this was indeed organic tissue, impossibly preserved through methods that defied contemporary medical understanding. James's skin retained its color and elasticity, his hair appeared freshly combed, his clothing showed no signs of the decay that should have affected natural fibers in burial conditions, but it was the position of the body that provoked the greatest horror among the witnesses. James had been buried lying peacefully on his back, hands folded across his chest, in traditional repose. When the casket was opened, his position had changed. His right hand was raised slightly, fingers curved as though reaching towards something. His head had turned fractionally to one side. Most disturbing of all, his eyes, which had been closed at burial, were now slightly open, revealing a sliver of what appeared to be preserved corneal tissue that retained an unsettling clarity. The physicians present immediately recognized they were observing something unprecedented. Dr. Malcolm Hendricks, chief pathologist at Massachusetts General, conducted a preliminary examination at the graveside and documented findings that would later form the basis of one of the most controversial medical reports of the 19th century. James's tissues showed cellular preservation far beyond anything achievable with known embalming techniques. More significantly, when Hendricks tested for certain chemical compounds, he discovered substances that had no legitimate medical application and whose effects on human tissue were entirely unknown to Western medicine. The detailed autopsy performed on James Morrison's exhumed body took 3 days and involved some of the most prominent medical minds in New England. What they discovered rewrote assumptions about the limits of tissue preservation and raised questions that medical science still struggles to answer over a century later. Dr. Hendricks' final report, portions of which remain classified in Harvard Medical School archives, documented findings that challenged the fundamental understanding of death itself. The chemical analysis of James's tissues revealed compounds that had never been catalogued in medical literature. Helena had somehow obtained or synthesized substances that could maintain cellular integrity far beyond normal limits. More disturbing were the neurological findings. When brain tissue samples were examined under microscopy, they showed preservation of cellular structures that normally degraded within hours of death. The synaptic connections appeared intact, the cellular membranes showed no signs of rupture, and there were chemical markers suggesting that some form of low-level metabolic activity might have continued for weeks after clinical death. But the most controversial findings concerned what Dr. Hendricks termed evidence of post-mortem awareness. The position changes observed in James's body could not be explained by normal post-mortem processes. The muscular movements required to shift posture and open eyes demanded neurological input that should have been impossible in a dead body. Yet the physical evidence was undeniable. Something had caused James's body to move in the 6 weeks between burial and exhumation, and the only possible source of such movements was residual brain function maintained by Helena's experimental preservation techniques. When confronted with these findings, Helena Morrison provided authorities with detailed documentation of her procedures. Her journals revealed years of theoretical preparation, correspondence with experimental researchers in Europe, and a methodical plan to use James's unique neurological condition, his tendency toward deep cataleptic states caused by generations of genetic damage, as the foundation for an unprecedented experiment. She had not simply preserved her son's body, she had attempted to maintain some form of consciousness beyond clinical death, using the boundary condition created by his inbred genetics as a bridge between life and something beyond conventional understanding. The legal and ethical questions raised by Helena's experiments occupied medical boards and legal scholars for months. She had clearly violated regulations regarding treatment of human remains and conducted medical experiments without oversight or ethical review. But she had also achieved something that suggested possibilities medical science was not ready to confront. The question became not just whether what she had done was legal, but whether humanity was prepared for the implications of her success. Helena Morrison was never formally charged with any crime. The evidence was too complex, the medical questions too profound, and the potential for public panic too great. Instead, a quiet arrangement was made. Helena agreed to leave Massachusetts permanently and cease all experimental work. In exchange, the full details of her procedures would remain sealed in medical archives, accessible only to qualified researchers under strict conditions. She departed Boston in March 1888, and her subsequent whereabouts were never officially documented. James Morrison's body was cremated immediately after the completion of medical examinations, ensuring that no further experiments could be conducted. But the photograph remained, and it is this image that continues to disturb researchers who study it. Modern neurological analysis has revealed that viewers of the photograph experience specific patterns of brain activity associated with recognizing consciousness in others. Somehow the image captures something beyond simple visual representation, perhaps some residual imprint of the awareness that Helena's techniques had maintained, frozen forever in the moment between life and death. The Morrison family name disappeared from Boston society within a generation. The mansion was sold and later demolished. The genetic line that had twisted back upon itself for 2 centuries finally ended, taking with it the biological curse that had made James's unique fate possible. But the photograph survives in medical archives, a testament to what one desperate mother achieved when she refused to accept the boundary between life and death, and to the dark possibilities that emerge when genetic degradation, experimental medicine, and maternal obsession converge. James Morrison remains suspended in that Victorian chair, neither fully alive nor truly dead, preserved forever in the liminal space his moth created for him, a space that may have allowed some fragment of his consciousness to persist long after his heart stopped beating, trapped in an existence that defies our most fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. If this story has disturbed you, if you've glimpsed the dark territories where science meets the inexplicable and family secrets become medical nightmares, then you understand why some archives remain locked, why some photographs carry warnings, and why some truths about our past are too unsettling to be widely known. The Morrison case reminds us that the most horrifying stories are not fiction, but documented history, preserved in medical journals and photographic plates, waiting for those brave enough to look directly at what we were never meant to see.